We are here at the 2014 Pasadena Book Fair, sponsored by the Southern California chapter of ABAA, and we're going to be interviewing John Howell. Not the John Howell that most of us old-timers remember, but a young and new and vibrant John Howell. And John, it's good to have you here.
Thank you.
And could you give us something of your background, your family, siblings, where you went to school, where you grew up, and things of that nature, sort of a little biopic?
Biography of myself?
Yeah, thumbnail.
I am the fourth of 5 children born to my parents. My mother is actually a native of Pasadena. My father grew up in Washington State, and they met at the University of California, Berkeley, during the Second World War, were married, and after the war, my father returned to Washington State and finished a degree in physics at the University of Washington, and then he came to Los Angeles to work in the defense industry. And so I was 2 years old when the family moved here to Los Angeles, and I lived 14 years in a suburban home just north of LAX, which is no longer there now. The airport has expanded,
Yeah.
taking those streets out. So that's the general biography. I spent 3 years tour in the United States Army, non-combat arms, Germany, Europe, in the early 1970s, got out in 75, and then I spent quite a few years studying history. The last school I attended was UCLA, where I took a candidate in philosophy degree, so I have everything that's required except for a dissertation submitted. And when it became apparent that was not going to be finished, I spent a little time, a couple of years working for Barnes & Noble in a retail environment. My daughter was born in 1995, and I spent 13 months taking care of her. My wife is a librarian at USC, and after that I was casting around, not really looking for a career or to make my place in the world. I was just looking for a job, and one of the first places I went was to speak to my wife's faculty advisor in the library school at UCLA, and he recommended that I speak to Ken Carmiel, who's a local LA dealer, and Jeff Weber. And it was Jeff who offered me a job cataloging books for him. I spent 8 years doing that. I think when I went to work for him in '96, I think he was on something like catalog 38, 39, 40. And when I left 8 years later, I think he had 4 or 5 catalogs in the can, something in series 115, somewhere around that range. So we produced.
There's only so much one person can do.
Yeah, exactly. We produced a lot of catalogs in those years. I got to handle a lot of very interesting materials. Some to think of. One particular book was, Jeff specialized in science and medicine, and he had a lot of collections that were coming available, and he would purchase them, collections on entomology, insects. There was a Westfall collection of Newton. He handled at one point a Bremer edition of the works of Vesalius, who was a 16th century anatomist. And the Bremer press was in Germany, and they had the blocks from the original Vesalius, the first work, which was anatomy based on actual dissections. And they printed this last edition of the Vesalius using the original wood blocks, and then World War II happened, and the plates were destroyed.
Oh, yeah.
So that was a special book to handle. So there's a variety of things that
Would
we
you
handled
consider
over the
yourself a specialist or a generalist?
I consider myself an opportunist.
Okay. That means you're a generalist.
Yes, exactly.
Anything I can make a buck on?
When I left working for Jeff, I didn't have any customers, no customer base, no inventory, and so I've been working, developed specializations, particularly in California history, California ephemera, and fine press printers of California. So that's where.
When did you
my
go to the
specialty-
book school? When did you go to the Colorado Book School?
2010. That was your last year.
Yeah, my last year.
Your
yeah.
retirement year in Ed's.
Yeah, that was a nice little party at
Yeah.
the end, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was great.
You obviously involved in the internet.
Yes.
What is your involvement there? Do you have, how many items, for example, do you have online? And do you have your own homepage?
I have a website, johnhowellforbooks.com. My total inventory online is well under 1,000. Right now, I'm probably at about 750. When I first started selling books, I think I was pretty naive. And I was sort of, okay, I now have a business license. And
Yeah.
I was going to the gym pretty regularly at the time, so I'm telling people, I have a bookstore, I'm a bookseller. And one particular acquaintance at the gym said, well, you know what, I'm looking for a complete edition of Shakespeare. I want all of the works in one volume. Well, I have that. And I sold it to him for like $35. It was a reprint, Barnes & Noble reprint of the Yale edition. And he bought it, and then I thought, well, what do I do now?
Yeah, yeah, I've sold a book.
And that's how naive I was, when I began that process. And I spent quite a few years trying to figure out how to list things on the various
Matching services.
Yeah, services like Amazon, ABAA, and so on and so forth. Probably
A-Libris.
spent A-Libris. Probably spent too much time doing that. But for several years, 90% of my sales came through those venues. And just before I attended CABS, I started working more on trying to buy things that were California oriented or fine press oriented. And what I was finding was, as I worked into a specialty, those venues were of no help to me. My sales were going way down. But what I wanted to learn at CABS was sort of like an overall view of the trade.
Oh, I just want to explain for our viewers and listeners that CAB stands for Colorado Antiquarian Book School, and it's based in Colorado Springs, and it's an annual event that has been going on for over 35 years, I believe. So continue. I just wanted a little editorial note.
Yep. And what I wanted to learn when I went was the overall trade. I mean, I'd seen it working for Jeff, but what he expected of me was to catalog. And so that's what I was doing. There's a lot more to the trade than just writing a book description. So I didn't have a lot of experience in those other things. That's what I learned at CABS. And in a way, CABS was sort of like giving me approval. Okay, now you can go do these other things. You can start doing book fairs. You can start issuing your own lists, so on and so forth. So starting about 2010, I started doing more fairs. And where I do most of my business these days are at book fairs and using various listservs. The ABAA has both a trade list, which is an announcement of items for sale to other booksellers, and then there's a public list which reaches beyond the trade to collectors. So various list serves, I produce lists that are distributed that way through email, and the book fairs are where most of my business. So from being 90% via the third-party online venues, now those venues only do about probably less than 10% for me. And
Those were your opening salvos.
right.
And once the explosion occurs, you begin to realize that there's a lot of other ways to get it done.
Yep.
Do you have an open shop, or are you by appointment only?
Well, I work out of my home, which is a condominium of less than 1,000 square feet, which, well, my daughter just went to college this fall. It was 3 people living there in less than 1,000 square feet, and the book business occupies a very small corner of that. Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about some of the people in the trade that you looked up to as mentors, or that you learned a lot from in your young book selling career.
Well, I think perhaps foolishly on my part, I wasn't tied into the trade from '96 to 2010 that carefully. I was busy doing that online thing and preoccupied with that, and I don't think I should have been. I think the folks in the trade are happy to have new members come in.
Absolutely.
And happy to share their knowledge. They'd like to know that they're not giving hard-earned knowledge away for free or for nothing. But if you have a passion for this, if someone has a passion for the trade, there's plenty of people to help. Don Connor passed away recently.
Yeah, I always liked Don.
And when he passed, the interview he did for this series, I watched for the first time, and I realized how generous he had been to me over the years, and I wasn't even really aware of the kindness he had offered to me until I saw his interview, and was aware that I met him very early working for Jeff, and he had always taken an interest in me, and always had wanted to know what I was up to, and so on and so forth. And the last time I saw him was at one of the Sacramento fairs a couple years ago, and I had something in my booth that I wasn't all that confident about. You know, is the price really reasonable, and so on and so forth. And he sat down and took a lot of time to talk with me about that particular item that he knew quite a bit about, and was always perfectly willing to share. So I'd say Michael Thompson, when I was about 2011 or so, after I'd done cabs, I was now starting to think more seriously about ABAA membership, and I went over to Michael Thompson's on one occasion just with the intention of talking to him about it. This was late in the year, in the fall, and well, ABA membership, maybe we should talk about it. And all of a sudden he just started laying out all the steps, and I got out my pen and a piece of paper and started writing them down, and there it was, a whole program,
right.
How to get the application done, the steps to be taken, and he was very generous to me, especially at that time period, really helped me a lot. In terms of really specific people, those are the people who come to mind. But
yeah, you know, there's probably others that you will think about when you leave here.
Yeah, exactly.
but you know, everybody in their trade, in their education as a bookseller, has to latch on to someone who is going to be helpful to them. Just because this is the kind of trade where, without the sharing, without the camaraderie, without the collegiality, it wouldn't exist.
Well, something that's been interesting to me studying history, one of my interests studying history was in religion and family structure. So you see families in the West have many different organizations. And now, as people in the trade, it's hard to afford a shop, an open shop especially, they're moving their business into the home. So when I first went to work with Jeff, he was working out of the home that he shared with his wife and his 2 children, and it's very intimate.
Yeah, it is.
And it's not easy for everybody, especially Americans, think of, you know, a mother and a father and their children, but to add an employee to the mix and so on can be awkward. But I think that's kind of interesting about the trade is because in a way it's not a handcraft per se like bookbinding, but it has that something of the craft and apprenticeship element to it, where you need to learn from someone who has it's an esoteric knowledge, and that has to be passed on in some way, and in some ways that relationship is intimate.
Yeah, I like to think that these videos that we're doing 50 years from now, people will look at them and sometimes they'll laugh because, oh, what were they doing? What were they thinking? How could they possibly do it this way?
Or the mistakes that I made.
But I think all in all, of all the businesses that I've seen around, this is probably the business where you have the most nice people. When you think about businesses who are always trying to kill each other, I really think the antiquarian book trade is based on a kind of, you know, love of books, love of collegiality, and like you said, we have to have more young people get turned on, because the trade is not going to last with us old timers.
Well, you probably saw there's an ABAA discuss list, which is also an email distribution, and one member had made the comment, well, we need a farm system.
I saw that.
And we need young people, and it was very interesting to see the number of people who did not, well, they weren't disagreeing with him that we need a farm system, but they were saying there are farm systems in place.
Already in place.
ABAA, CABS, the various rare book schools that are. There's the California Rare Book School, the one at University of Virginia, and how important those elements are to supplementing, adding to the knowledge that people have in the trade.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting when you think in terms of the way things used to be and the way things are. It's night and day. But I think one of the main things is the personality of the bookseller turning on customers and collectors to a specific thing that they may have an interest in. It's our passion transferring to them. And I think that's really going to be one of the things we have to look for in the future.
Yeah, that's an interesting element. Warren Howell at John Howell Books in San Francisco.
Not John Howell for books, but John Howell Books.
Right, John Howell hyphen Books. The great San Francisco store. I never met Warren, but he has this reputation because of my name. People are telling me all the time stories about Warren.
Of course.
And he had, from what I've heard, had an outsized personality, someone who was very outgoing, very voluble, I guess, and would fill up a room. I don't see my personality as being exactly like Warren's, but
it's a different era.
But what you were describing, the ability to, I don't know, transfer the passion. I may be quiet, but you still have the passion for the material. There's something really interesting. There's a great story there. I've been working with some of the Dawson's material recently.
Yeah, I've seen that on the net.
Yeah, and one book that I have in stock for this book fair is a book about shells. And it came from Glenn, and the reason Glenn has it is that his wife, Mary Helen, was very interested in shells, and they would go to Baja California as a family in the 1950s, spend their time on the beach and collect shells, and there were several books that she had to supplement it. And one of the books that I have here is an early 19th century book on shells with plates, hand-colored, but inside of it is a letter from Mark Cohen of Marks and Company, a long letter on a piece of paper and completely filled on both sides with a very warm and intimate letter from Mary Helen. And this book he had acquired it in England and sent it to her with this letter as a gift to go into her shell collection. And I learned that Ernest Dawson had sent Glenn to England to learn the book trade in the 1930s.
Yep.
So he had established these connections with Marks and Company, and after he had spent his time in England, he decided, well, I'm a mountain guy and I want to do some skiing in the Alps, which he did, and then he just kept going east and eventually got on the Trans-Siberian Railroad and circumnavigated the globe. So,
wow.
So it's those kinds of stories, intimate stories that go with the books that are you can get a text and read it on your iPad, and that's what you have, a digital.
Yeah.
But these are books that we're dealing with that are our culture.
Mm-hmm.
And you can pass them on, and then they can be passed on again to another generation. So
I think that's probably the most wonderful part of the business, is that we're constantly seeing great books and then constantly trying to find them again. It's like a never-ending cycle, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Before we wind up, what do you see as some of the major challenges facing our organization as we move 10, 15 years into the future?
I'm not sure I have an answer to that.
That's okay. You don't need to have an answer.
I don't really know.
It's all right.
Got to keep the fairs going.
Got to keep the book schools and
plenty of people retiring, so we need to have, people. This is often a trade people don't retire from. They move on in a more substantial manner. So, having new people to come in, but that's what we're doing.
Someone once said, to paraphrase things, that old booksellers never die; they just reappear in young booksellers.
Okay.
Think about that.
Well,
we've got one or two more minutes, and do you find it easier to be a bookseller here in the West Coast as opposed to perhaps being a bookseller on the East Coast?
That's how to answer that. I don't get out to the East Coast.
No. So you strictly do the fairs west of the Mississippi?
West of the Rocky Mountains.
Even more central.
Yeah. In fact, I'm pretty much West Coast based at this point. So I have about 6 fairs or so that I do a year. Seattle's the farthest, and there's one in Oregon that I have not shown at. So all the rest of my fairs are California.
Yeah, you're strictly West Coast. Yeah. Do you see yourself moving east to book fairs? Perhaps doing New York or Boston one of these days?
I think I'd like to. I think my main concern with that is I have to have enough material.
Oh, that's key.
In the booth, so that I can cover my expenses. The states out here on the west are enormous in terms of size compared to the states on the East Coast.
Right.
And the East Coast has a lot more fairs that are local.
Regional.
Regional fairs. And my impression is you don't have to travel as far to attend those. If I were to expand my fair, probably my next two likely candidates would be the Portland Fair and the Denver Fair. And the Denver Fair would get me east of the Rockies.
Yeah.
But that's a long way to go. I mean, it's a couple days drive. I mean, if I'm going to drive to those, so you lose 4 days of work, and so it's a challenge.
Well, you might want to look at it as fun.
Well, yeah, and one of the things that I need to improve on is in the scouting.
Yeah.
Learning how to go into a store and look for things and dig out the things that will fit in my specialty, and that's something that I need to practice. And maybe I can find a store in the Arizona desert where I have to spend a day driving through it to get to Denver. Maybe that's what I need to be doing more of. But
stopping along the way, seeing what other people have, making judgments whether to buy or not.
Mm-hmm.
Well, John, it's been great talking to you.
Well,
thank you very much for coming by, and
My pleasure.
enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Good. Thanks.